You say? Thank you for the enthusiasm. Great. So why don't you go to the next slide, Tori? So this is our family about 11 years ago. Myself, my husband, Scott, who is here. Our older daughters, Elizabeth, was in 6th grade. So how many of you are 6th graders? Do we have? So she was exactly your age when we lived there. Rachel was in 3rd grade. Andrew, who's the cute little guy over there, is now this big grown-up 18-year-old. And Abigail, who just got confirmed last year, so is just a tiny bit older than you, was 3 when we lived there. So this is us in Denver before we took off. So next slide. So I don't know if any of you have heard of the Fiji Islands before or have maybe been there, but if you see that dot in the middle between where it says Denver and Fiji Islands, that's Hawaii. And the big island to the west of Fiji is Australia, and then New Zealand is kind of right under there. So it's down in the South Pacific Ocean. It's pretty far from here. It was about a 15-hour trip from Denver, so a long plane ride. You can go to the next slide. So Fiji is made up of about 300 islands. Some are very, very tiny. Nobody lives on them. We were on the main island called Viti Levu, and we were at a children's home called Dilkusha Children's Home. And one thing that I want to talk about is in these faith stories, you know, we're supposed to kind of tell about our faith and our journey. And I'm going to tell you why we went there. And it's not really I was called by God to go work with these children for a year. What happened is my husband, Scott, was offered a job in Indonesia, and he went and visited, and we were kind of feeling excited about going and doing something different. And the job was working for a mining company. And so we were really almost ready to commit to moving there. And we found out some of the practices that the mining company used, and we weren't really comfortable with it. And so we said, no, we're not going to take this job. The whole family was kind of disappointed that we weren't going to go live somewhere else for a year or more. So we started looking at other opportunities. And this opportunity we found through the Methodist Church. And so we just decided, well, we're just going to go and take off. It was a volunteer program. They have a lot of volunteers that work all around the world. And so we thought, let's just go and see what this is about. So why don't you go to the next slide? So we spent a year at Dilkusha Children's Home. And Dilkusha, the translation is delight to the heart. And like I said, it's a children's home. It's primarily for children who possibly were abused by their family. A lot of kids were neglected. Their families were so poor, they didn't have money to be able to feed and clothe and send their kids to school, so they needed some extra help. So there were about 50 children there. Most of them were girls. It's primarily a girls' school or girls' home. There were a few boys, some with special needs, and then a couple very young brothers that had older sisters that lived there, and they didn't want to separate those families. The boys can stay there till they're 8, and then they would have to go to the boys' home, which is around the other side of the island. So if they have sisters, they wouldn't be able to see them very often. These are some of the girls that live there. So you can go to the next slide. This is most of the girls and a lot of the staff that live there. The girls are either native Fijian, and they look like typical, I would say, like African American. You know, they have kind of the curly, dark hair, dark skin. And there were also a lot of Indian people from Indian descent. And about, how long ago was it? Do you remember when the Indians came over? Okay, 150 years ago, many Indians came from India to help work in the sugarcane fields, kind of as farmers. And so there's a lot of Indian people that live in Fiji also. One reason why we chose to live there is English was the language that they spoke because it was owned by the British colonies long ago before it got its independence. So it was really easy to communicate with the people there. So that's a big reason why we chose to go there. Many of the staff are just unmarried women, and many of them sleep there because these kids need care or supervision around the clock. So girls would stay there usually until they got married, and arranged marriages are still common. It's a way for them to kind of get their freedom and move away from the home. Not many of these girls get to go to college. It's becoming a little bit more common now, but most of them stay there until they're married, and then they can move with their husband's family. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about kind of what a typical day was like for the children that were there. And again, many of them were your age. And this is kind of a view of the home. It's kind of from our house. We lived up on a hill. On the left side of the screen is the dormitory where they stayed, and the kitchen, and then just kind of some buildings. So why don't you go to the next slide? So all the kids get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. How many of you are awake at 5 o'clock in the morning? Some of you might be. Oh, do you love it? Yeah, you do. You're an early morning person? Yeah. So everyone would wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they would go immediately to have devotions all together. And then you can go to the next slide. Kids would all do their chores. One of the biggest chores that they had was called picking, and that is kind of like raking up and cleaning up leaves. So they would walk around the grounds, pick up leaves, put them in the box, and they will burn them later. But they all had chores that they had to do before school. Okay, the next slide. This is their dining room, so they would have all their meals there. And generally, they would maybe have a little bit of toast or kind of leftovers from the night before. None of these kids were hungry, but there was not an overabundance of food. Next slide. Okay, so then it was time to go off to school. This is actually a picture of Andrew's classroom. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, so they would spend the day in school, they'd come home and study, and we spent a lot of our time helping the kids study because there were only about 5 or 6 adults to help all these kids with their homework, and these kids were struggling definitely with academics, so we would help them with their studies. And next slide. So this is the way that they got to wash their clothes. There was kind of a very old cement tubs outside. They would wash their clothes, and all the kids were responsible for their own, starting at a really young age. I would say probably 6 or 7-year-old kids were completely responsible for taking care of that, and then hang them out to dry. So that was what they would do after school. And the next slide, please. And then we would have devotions again. So twice a day, these kids would get devotions. And devotions would be at about 6:30. And then the younger kids would go to bed because they had to wake up at 5. And some of the older kids would continue to do their homework. So that's a very typical day for the kids that lived there. Do you want to add anything, Scott? Okay. All right. So on the next slide. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what our experience was like and our kids. So when they were there, Elizabeth, like I said, was in 6th grade, Rachel was 3rd grade, and Andrew was 1st grade. And we chose to have them go to school with the local people because we really wanted them to feel a part of the community and know what it was like for these kids. And we didn't want to say that, oh, we're better than you, we're not going to go to school with you. So it was a very different experience for them. So if you go to the next slide, and Scott, can you come and hold this? So all the students would wear uniforms. So maybe I'll have you hold this. So 6th graders, this is what you would get to wear to school. And as I dug that out of a box this morning, I thought if I would be in school, I would probably get my hand slapped because it was not perfectly ironed. So uniforms had to be clean and ironed. So our kids were, Andrew didn't iron his clothes as a first grader, but Rachel certainly was ironing her clothes as a third grader. It's very thin, so it would dry because they didn't have clothes dryers, and it rains a lot in Fiji. And so it had to be super thin so it could dry. This little pocket is supposed to have a handkerchief in it, and your handkerchief had to be there, and it had to be ironed, or you probably would get your hand slapped. So that's what they wore. About once or twice a month, they would have sports day on a Friday, so the girls got to wear a special uniform with some little bloomers underneath a skirt so they could run around a little more easily and play kickball or whatever they would do, and a little tank top. And yes, this was a treat to wear these uniforms instead of the regular dresses. So they would get excited on sports day to be able to wear this. And we do have an example of what the boys wore. When you were little, you just kind of had your collared shirt and shorts. And so this was Andrew's little school uniform. Do you want to model it for them? When the boys got older into more of a high school age, then they wore what's called a sulu, which is kind of a wraparound skirt.
And you may have noticed on some of these clothes, there's autographs. On their final day of school there, the classmates all signed their uniforms as kind of a memento. So that's been a fun memory.
So, boys, when you get to high school, you would get to wear this wraparound skirt, complete with pockets and everything. But this is what the boys would wear to school every day, kind of with a collared shirt. So, and most of the local men would wear that just as their everyday clothes. Would wear this wraparound skirt called a sulu. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this was Rachel's class. Lots larger classes were usually about, I would say, 35 or 40 kids. And what you might notice here, how many of you have a chalkboard in your classroom? Probably not very many. So they definitely still had chalkboards. Lots of just handwritten posters around the school. That's kind of how the kids learned. You can go to the next slide. And these were their desks. So it kind of reminds me of if you've ever read Little House on the Prairie books or seen some of those old schools. It was very similar to that. You'd share a desk with somebody, old wooden ones. So that's what her classroom looked like. And we can go to the next slide. This was Andrew's class. He and about 40 other kids, and I'll probably embarrass him just a little bit, but it was a pretty traumatic experience for Andrew because, kindergarten teachers they just like the nicest people in the whole world, and they're so very sweet. And then we went there in first grade, and he was surrounded by these very rowdy, probably 40 little first graders, and what would happen is the kids would all go to school, and then the teachers would have time for their devotion, so they'd shut the door, lock it, and all the kids would stay inside. And of course, what do 6 and 7-year-old boys do? They run around, jump off the tables, throw paper airplanes and pencils at each other. So that's kind of how his morning started. It was pretty hard for him to get used to school, and we would bribe him with ice cream and other treats to be able to stay the whole day. Do you want to add anything more about that?
One interesting thing that happened to Andrew is a lot of these kids had seen white-skinned people, but from far away. And so it was very fascinating for them. And Abigail experienced this too when they'd go to town. It was the first time that they'd seen people up close with white skin or blue eyes. And so they would come up and really examine you and touch and try to figure out what blonde hair was. And it was some very interesting experiences for them to see that so close.
A lot of the work of the first graders was learning nursery rhymes because they would speak kind of the local language in their homes, but they were still learning English. So that was a lot of what Andrew did, was recite nursery rhymes over and over in school. So you can go to the next slide. Oh, this just kind of shows the classroom with the tables. In Fiji, every home has multiple woven mats. Most of their meals they sit on the floor and eat, and a lot of the activities in the classroom they would sit on the floor. So you can see the mats that they would use inside the classroom. You can go to the next slide. This was, because their school year is a little different than ours, this was Elizabeth's 7th grade classroom. So again, kind of the old wooden desks. And one thing that I didn't mention is when these kids would go to school, there was one janitor or groundskeeper, I would say, for the whole entire school with about 800 students. And so the first thing that they would do when they got to school was they would wash the windows, they would sweep and wash the floors, they would wash the toilets. That was just kind of the job of the students. They would rake the leaves and put them in piles and burn them. So that's kind of how they started their school day. So you can go to the next slide. I thought you guys might be interested, can you come up here again, in some of their textbooks. So I'm going to read this one first. Okay. This was the health science, and it's kind of interesting that they learn how to take care of pit toilets and the best location for toilets. Have any of you learned about that in your science class? No. They talked about water supply and how to keep it clean and collecting rainwater. They would learn about how to take care of rubbish and why it would cause a problem because dogs might get into it or it might get smelly. So it's just some interesting things that they learned about, and I can pass these around. They had to do a lot of, just like in their math book, you would have to write out the whole problem and then solve it, and you'd have to, there's a lot of writing and not a whole lot of textbooks that they would use. Another interesting thing is when Elizabeth started her 7th grade class, she got there the first day of school, and no teacher arrived, and it kind of, the day went on, and they found out that their teacher had been in an auto accident and wouldn't be there for probably 2 weeks. And there was no substitute teacher. So the girls kind of went and hung around for a few hours and then finally went home. But school was kind of casual like that. Okay, the next slide. This is just a picture of kind of their award ceremony at the end of the year. And so again, the whole ground would be covered with tarps or mats, and students would sit on the floor for probably about 3 hours they sat there. And when they would have any kind of gathering, that's how it was done. So a little different than probably your award ceremony at your school. And the next slide. Oh, just some special days that they had. They would have dress-up day when they didn't have to wear their uniforms and they got to wear their clothes of their native dress, and that was kind of hard for us to figure out what we would wear, so our kids ended up wearing t-shirts and jeans. Not near as interesting as what you see these girls wear, but kind of typical of what Americans wore. And just some of their other local dress. And you can go to the next. And this again was at the prize giving day. Hula dancing was very popular there, and most of the girls learn it in school, and it's a part of a lot of the celebrations. This was one of my favorite parts of the day. This picture was taken from our house, which is very close to the school, and at the end of the day, this isn't all the girls, but there are about 800, and they would all gather outside and say the Lord's Prayer together, and then they would go home. And it was really neat listening to all those girls say that at the end of every day. So often Abigail does this talk with me, but she was 3, and honestly, she doesn't really remember very much. So I'll tell you a little bit about how she and I spent our days while the older kids were in school. So we would walk down about 150 stairs, and then we would have to walk across this bridge to where the city is in the background. And it was a small town of, I would say, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people. So we had a very, very small refrigerator, so every day we would have to go to town to shop for food that we would use that night. So you can go to the next slide. This is just part of downtown Nassau, which is the city that we were in, and we would find that we had to go to multiple stores to get what we needed. Most of our things we got at a market with fresh fruits and vegetables, but we'd have to go to a butcher to get our meat. There was a small grocery store we could get like milk and cheese, that sort of thing. But it took probably about 2 hours for us to leave our house and get our food for the day and then come back. This was just an example of the market. Very, very friendly people who just grow food near their homes or small farms and then bring it to the market and sell it there. So back here, my job is I work as a physical therapist, and I work with special needs kids. And in the home, there were probably about 5 or 6 children there with special needs, and the staff really didn't know anything about these kids. And this is Joshua, who was 9 at the time, who had very severe cerebral palsy. His muscles were very tight, and he had a lot of seizures. And he spent most of his day in a crib in the nursery because they just didn't know what to do with him. So I got them out and kind of showed them how to move his body and just interact with him more and just really encourage the people to talk to him. And I really, really feel like he couldn't communicate at all, but he was so much happier once people started talking with him and interacting with him. So I spent a lot of time with Joshua. Next slide. And we kind of built him a wheelchair so he could just get out and take walks, because really most of the time he had just been in a crib. And he loved it. He smiled all the time when we took him out on a walk. These are some of the other special needs kids. There were a few kids with autism, a girl with Down syndrome, just some girls with some learning disabilities. And most of the time, they would just sit around on the mat, and they didn't have very many toys. And I asked the people, the staff, why don't you have very many toys? They said, well, primarily they take the toys and they toss them and break them. So they just kind of sat around all day, and most of the time they were pretty naughty because they didn't have anything to do. So I really worked with the staff on ways that they could interact with the kids. And one of my biggest memories is finding a couple books that were very dusty at the home. And I was reading these little, Disney, Cinderella books to the little kids. And all of a sudden, all the high school girls came and just stayed there and listened, because nobody had really read them a story before. And they just loved it. And so they would sit there for about an hour listening to me reading to them because they hadn't experienced that before. And then we would certainly help the kids with homework. And again, here you see them working on the floor on their mats. And you can go to the next slide. Oh, this is another thing I got to do. This is Andrew's leg. So it was really hot and rainy and humid in Fiji. And do you know what you get when you're in areas that are really hot and humid? What do you get, man? Well, you get a lot of bugs. So these were all mosquito bites that got infected. This is really kind of what Andrew's legs looked like for the whole year that we were there. And we'd send him to school in long socks and pants, and he would still, somehow these mosquitoes loved his white skin. So every night we would bathe him and cover them with antibiotic cream. It used to drive him crazy. So it was not a perfect experience. We loved it, but there were some yucky things that went along with it. And the next slide. So how many kids have had lice at school? Have you ever had a lice outbreak at school? Yeah. So I love looking through hair with lice because I did that every single night. There's a lot of lice in Fiji. In fact, if you see some of the pictures of the girls, their hair is really pretty short. And they had to keep it short till they were in about high school, because if you had short hair, it was less likely that you got lice. And most of the older girls or the staff, you would see them, in the weekends out on the back porch, just going through each other's hair, pulling all the lice out. So all of us, you and Andrew didn't have it because your hair was so short, but all the rest of us got lice. So I got to go through their hair every night and pull out the little bugs. Oh, yeah, this is kind of a gross story. One day, Joshua, the boy with cerebral palsy, one of the staff said, "Can you come and look at his hair with me?" And his hair was probably about this long. And we looked, and we saw a lot of lice. So we cut his hair a little bit, and I would probably say there were maybe 1,000 bugs crawling around his head. And finally I said, let's just shave it all off. And we shaved it off and washed it all, and he got this big smile on his face. He couldn't scratch his head, and if you've ever had lice, it's really, really itchy. And so his scalp was just covered. And he had no way of telling us that he had it. So we shaved his head to the bone, and he was a happy boy after that. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention, we talked about this last session in confirmation, if any of you were in one of my groups, but the MOPS group here kind of said, hey, we'd like to do something for the children there. What can we do? And so I asked the girls, I said, what do you guys need that we could get you from the States? Well, undergarments, bras and underwear. They just couldn't get really high quality ones there, so that's what we had the MOPS group from Bethany send over there. We got all their sizes, and so they got coloring books and underwear, and let me tell you, they were so happy. I think the next picture maybe shows them with theirs. So these are a lot of the younger girls, but they were thrilled to get that, and MOPS was very generous to do that for them. Abigail, do you want to come and talk about your story? You don't have to. She really doesn't remember anything. She was just 3. But this is kind of what she did while we were there. Next slide. So she got to dance with some of the older girls at the home in front of the Prime Minister at one of the celebrations in Fiji. Dancing is a big, big part of their celebrations there. So you can go to the next one. She actually got to go to a tiny little preschool that they did for some of the kids. It was about an hour in the morning, and they would kind of learn colors. It was amazing. Some kids that were in 2nd and 3rd grade didn't even know their colors or all their letters. So they were trying to give some of these younger kids a little bit of a head start, and she participated with them. And this is at one of the celebrations where she and Scott were dancing, and the white stuff on her shoulder is baby powder. So at these kind of celebrations, the local people show their appreciation for you by spraying perfume all around and dumping baby powder all over everything. And so they were kind of showing their appreciation for us being there with them. And we did get to do a few outings with the girls to the beach. They don't get to go very often. I think this was around Christmas time. Christmas time there is very hot because it's in the southern hemisphere. So while they didn't have school, we got to go to the beach. They would wear shorts and T-shirts, right? No bathing suits. They're very modest dressers. All the girls would be in longer skirts or longer pants. I can show you. Women never wore shorts, and this is what I would wear every day, was just a shirt and a sulu, which is really just a piece of fabric, and you just tie it around, but you always had to have a dress or a skirt. Very modest dressers there. Yep. And this is just a picture of kind of the pretty part of Fiji. Okay, next slide. Church. So we are talking about our faith stories, and church is really, really important to the people there. So I think this may be more about, thank you, Scott, for modeling that. This may be more about the faith story of the people there than our faith story. I think if any of you have done any kind of mission work or, gone somewhere to help people, so many times we benefit so much more than they do because we learn so much from them. And church is really important to them. So you can go to the next slide. Our church was right across the street from the girls' home. And so it was just a quick walk over there. This is the inside of their church. Every now and then they would have somebody play guitar, but there's no organ or piano or anything. It was a very simple, plain church. The choir would lead the singing. The services were generally an hour and a half to 2 hours long every Sunday. And the kids would sit very quietly and pay attention. No air conditioning. It was hot. Everybody would get a fan. I got one with my name on it, so you'd have to bring your fan with you. It was very hot. And it was amazing how kids would just sit there the whole time. So this is when we would go up for communion, and I wondered if any of you can notice anything about what the people are wearing. They're not wearing any shoes, right? So the altar was very sacred. One person, I think, brought their sandals with them, but when they bowed at the altar, they would take them off. Most people would leave their shoes in their pews, and you would go up to the altar in bare feet before you received communion. Oh, you wouldn't wear them in your house or your classroom. You would always leave shoes outside the door. This was around Christmas time. They would go and sing at every member's home, sing Christmas carols for the week before Christmas. We always like to make Christmas cookies with our kids, and they had never done that before, so that's a little tradition that we brought with us. And they were very excited to use frosting, and thousands is what they call sprinkles there. So they had a great time with that. And this is kind of their nativity scene for their Christmas program. So they would decorate the whole church with palms, and kids would act out the whole Christmas story here. Harvest Sunday would kind of be like, when we've done, like packed rice and beans, and maybe you've brought food, canned food to church before to bring to Metro Care Ring. People would bring all their extra produce from their farms. So that's more what they would do on Harvest Sunday. I thought since we just got done celebrating Easter, I'd just talk a little bit more about that. This would be Palm Sunday, and they would reenact the whole story of Jesus going into Jerusalem. This is Andrew's best friend, Isaiah, here coming in. They would all have palms. All the children would wear white on Palm Sunday morning. You can go to the next slide. Here are just some of the girls on that morning, but everybody in white. And then from Good Friday to Easter morning, they kind of kept a prayer vigil at church. So they had some groups of people at church throughout that entire time praying. So this is a group of some of the women outside the church, probably either Friday or Saturday night, that were praying. And we went with the girls from the home. I think it was very, very early morning that we went for about 2 or 3 hours and prayed. So somebody's always there praying between that time. And next slide. And then many people would fast from Good Friday to Easter morning. And the only service they had was a sunrise service at about 5 a.m. because that's when the sun came up. And then they followed it by a very large breakfast where everybody brought lots and lots of food. It would kind of break their fast of fasting for that whole time. Oh.
If you want to go back to that slide. They would do an overflow. So outside, the church is up to the left, but that little temporary shed would be added, and because it rained so much, they would just put these up for a temporary seating during special occasions. And another thing, if you look back across the street, you can see the children's home there. My parents came to visit during Easter time frame, and that's Andrew kind of running in his Sulu outfit that Susan had talked about before for that particular gathering.
And then during the Easter service, they said, let's all march this afternoon and sing songs. And so all of a sudden, everybody just came back in the afternoon with no plans, and we just marched through the city. I mean, already Easter, we were probably at church for about 3 hours. And then we decided to have this march and singing through the town. I think there's one more picture, Tori. So we would stop on the street corner and sing. And that just reminded me about Sundays. Have you ever heard how Sunday is supposed to be a day of rest? Yeah. How many of you guys do that? Yeah, we don't either. But in Fiji, it's a very restful day. When we first got there, Scott will talk a little bit how he was doing some work on the house, like putting screens up in the windows, or our kids would be out playing. And the woman in charge of the children's home came and knocked on our door and said, "You can't be doing this on Sunday. Sunday is a day of rest." So all the stores are closed. Kids can't be out playing soccer. Hardly any buses run from town to town. It is a day to go to church and to rest the rest of the day, and they really, really value that. So we learned our lesson, and so we started resting on Sunday. Yes, so next slide. So I'm going to let Scott talk a little bit about what he did there.
Thank you. There were so many things like that, and once you knew that Sunday would be a day of rest, then all of a sudden you would work harder on the Saturdays or other days of the week, because you kind of go, okay, it'll be nice to know that I can relax on the weekend and read a book or do some homework and have some quiet time. So while Susan was talking a little bit about their days, these were some of the things that I worked on while I was there. We, as mentioned, we stayed up kind of in this little house at the top of a hill, and it was a fairly new home that had just been opened for some staff and other volunteers to stay at. And so it was a nice home, but there were some interesting things about it, being that it was brand new. It did not have screens, and as we talked about, our kids were especially susceptible to mosquitoes and so forth. And I think part of it might have been the skin color or our diet having a little bit of sugar in it. So one of the first projects was to put screens and build screen doors and so forth. Another one that I remember is they had made a shower. Now, there was no hot water. It's just cold water. And yet the shower floor would slope this way, but the drain was over here on this particular corner, and so we'd have this accumulation of water that would get set up in there, and so that wasn't terribly pleasant. So I became a plumber and an electrician and a carpenter and a few other activities. My profession is working with technology, and I had brought a computer because we would use it for communicating with people back home. The internet and email were just starting to become more popular, so that was great for us to be able to communicate with people. But we found a few computers there at the children's home that had been donated, but nobody had ever done anything with them. And so I began we actually cleaned up this whole room and made it into a study area and a computer lab and library, and dusted off a bunch of old things. And so we found these computers. So I then began to offer computer classes. Well, the first one I offered had about 50 people that all the girls from the home and their friends and families all wanted to come. So I had to have a sign-up sheet that just so it was a little bit more manageable. And I'd put a sign-up sheet up, and almost immediately it would be completely full with everybody taking slots. And as Susan mentioned, there were some of the girls who, if they didn't get married or they didn't have the grades to be able to stay in school, because if you weren't passing at 6th grade, you didn't go on to 7th grade or didn't go on to 8th grade or 9th grade. Each year, more and more of the kids would drop out of the education program. So having a chance for them to build some skills actually allowed a few of the kids, the girls or some of the other folks in town, to get some other employment. We found this swimming pool one day that had been sent over, and as we talked about, it gets very hot. So we spent the whole day blowing it up because there's no air pumps or anything like that, and then got it filled up with water, and boy, what a delight to the children at the home to be able to do that. Another tradition around the Christmas time is people will pour water on folks as kind of a sneak attack to splash them with water. And so we threw a few girls into the tub and some of the staff, so we really had a fun time with that. This was their playground when we got there. So that's a broken set of swings, which had kind of rusted and fallen apart. It was here in the mud, and you can see the concrete supports that the swing set was attached to were just out of the ground because of erosion and so forth. And as Susan mentioned, there's not a real way to release a lot of pent-up energy in the kids. So the swing set was nice, and they wanted to really use it. But if it ever did start to rain, because it's hard to wash clothes and get the kids clean, they would immediately stop. So again, we were thinking about what kind of gift could we give to the home, and the church here, Bethany, said, we'd like to help. What can we do? And so we came up with the idea of a covered playground. And so you'll see some pictures of that. And so I led a project, and I used the girls at the home. Usually girls weren't allowed to use hammers or screwdrivers. That was men's work and so forth. But we said, no, we do that as part of our family. And so the project was to build a new playground, and then we're going to have a roof on top so that it could be played either on a hot sunny day where they'd have some shade, and then or during a rainstorm. So lots of pictures of that coming together. We used parts that we found, that little climbing ladder, and then a lot of the railings are old crib parts, if those would have been the sides of a crib. And then those slides, there was another woman from Australia. Usually slides in Fiji were either metal or wooden. And as you can imagine, both of those have some bonus features of hot or splinters. And so we actually got some of the more of the plasticky slides that I think you guys are probably used to. The day we put that up, the girls came home from school, and it was constant. They would just constant go through there, and all of them at the same time, as you can see. And that slide probably had more use in the first 90 minutes than slides that I've ever seen. So it was just amazing. We're getting close to kind of the finished product. So there were it ended up being a multi-stage thing to climb up and hang out, little areas for people to relax in. And then finally, we started decorating, and we called it the Helping Hands Play Center. And so we took handprints of all the children at the home and some of the other visitors and so forth, and had handprints and painted them and put their name on them. And so this is the one representing Bethany and the contribution from the Helping Hands here. So I think that may be it.
I'm just going to wrap this up in a few minutes, but I forgot to mention your cards and pens. If you have a question that you want to ask, you can certainly, we'll open it for questions when we're done, but if there's something you want to write down, feel free to do that, either to remember to ask, or if you're just a little nervous about asking questions in front of people, you can write it down and we'll turn those in. This is just finishing up. We were there for their 100th year celebration that the home had been there, and so I just thought it'd be kind of fun just for you to see a little bit about their traditions. It involves a lot of food. This is a big slab, probably of pig or cow, I don't know what. You can go to the next slide. So they would bury this in the ground, and then a lot of stones. It's called a lovo, and that's how they would cook a lot of the food in their homes, and that's how they did it for this celebration. Lots and lots of food. And next slide. Tropical fruits are really plentiful in Fiji. That's one thing interesting. It is a third world country, but people really don't go hungry because things do grow there. Whereas like in Africa, there might be droughts and you can't grow a lot of crops. In Fiji, you could grow things quite easily. So it was nice that you didn't see a lot of really hungry people there. Not very rich or wealthy, but not hungry. This is just some of the women preparing some of the food. Again, you see them sitting on the mats, working down there. And then we would get started to decorate all the poles, and all these people, you see they kind of have dresses like mine. This is not something I usually wear to church on Sunday, but this is very typical of dresses that women would wear on a special day. So we're all sitting on the floor. A lot of dancing. These are the men kind of in their native, their Sulus, their skirts, lots and lots of flowers. I think one of our kids got this like on a prize day, so they would have, this is one that you can keep, most of them would be fresh flowers that they would use. Okay, next slide. Again, kind of just more the native warrior kind of dance. Do you want to talk about this stuff that we brought? So these are little interesting artifacts. Fortunately, we never saw these in use, but one reason why the Methodist Church had a large presence in Fiji is Methodist missionaries were the first people to go there. But not a lot of them stayed there because cannibalism was very popular in Fiji a long time ago. So this one right here that you guys have, that was, I think, what they would poke the brains out with, and then, yeah, yum, yum. So these were all tools that historically were used by the cannibals in Fiji. Kind of a nasty, yeah, do you have the axe there? Mm-hmm. Kind of nasty stuff. That, like I said, that's not in practice anymore, but it was for quite some time. So this is kind of the men dressed up kind of in their old kind of warrior clothing. And then I think the next one just shows some of the people doing some of the native dancing. So these were the girls that Vinaka Vakalevu means thank you very much. So they made this sign to show their appreciation for Bethany, for what we had done, sending them the gifts, and for the playground. They were very, very thankful. And the next slide, I think, is the last one. So this is Luisa, and Mode is saying goodbye, and she really wanted to come home with us in her suitcase. But she didn't. So... yes, yeah, it's been fun, though. Now some of these girls are on Facebook. I think technology is advanced in Fiji, so we get to keep up with them now, especially some of the older girls. So, again, you know, we really weren't, I didn't have this great call from God. If you were here last week and you heard Ron kind of talk about how God really talks to him, I think a lot of times it's really hard to listen to God and hear what he's saying, and it wasn't a go to Fiji, Wiggins family, that we heard, but little by little, we were prompted to go there, and I think we learned a lot about faithfulness and God from them, the time that they take to worship God and think about him and sing songs. There's a lot of singing that goes on there, and I think we just really grew from the love that we were shown from the people there. I think one of the big things that we did actually was to show these kids how families love each other, because so many of them were there because their families, either they had been abused or neglected. They really didn't know what it was like to live in a family with a mom and a dad who loved them and cared for them and wanted the best for them. So we were able to show them that, and I'm hoping that as they get older and maybe have families of their own, that they can take that love with them. So that really is the end of our slideshow. Do any of you have questions about anything that you either want to ask or turn your papers in? Should we just, if you have a question, you want to jot it down, and we'll send them to the end of the row. We'll give you just a minute or two. And then if anybody has any other questions, we'll take them. Oh, go ahead. Yes. Really, it's not like, so Ben was asking about the classrooms, and it said 7X. It's just that there were probably 3 classrooms, and XYZ. It didn't mean like advanced or extra. It was just, that's the classroom you were in. So, yep. Yes. Okay, so some of the local food. So it was interesting because either you ate a lot of like local island food, or you had Indian food. So the local island food, there would be a lot of seafood because you're on an island. There was a lot of root vegetables that were kind of like potatoes. Dalo was one that we had a lot of, and again, it's very similar to potatoes. Then a lot of the fruits that they grew, pineapple, mango, were very, very popular. And then you had food from the Indian tradition, so lots of rice and curry, which we loved. One neat thing is often on Sundays, a church group or a business would bring meals to the home, so they didn't have to cook that day. And they had huge pots, and if there were leftovers, they would bring some to us. So we got to eat some really, really good food that people had cooked there. Sure, yes. So anything, like Scott said, that was Western was very expensive.
Yeah. So anything, anything that couldn't be grown locally. If you wanted a box of cereal or some of those things, pasta or something very expensive, you could find it in some stores that were set up that way. But the more you ate locally or like the natives, it was a much more plentiful and economical.
We were located about 30 minutes from the capital of Fiji, which was a little bit more developed, and there was one McDonald's there. And for Andrew's birthday, we took his little friend Isaiah, who was 8 or 9 at the time, to go there to watch a movie and go to McDonald's. It's the first time he had ever been to McDonald's in his life, and he was so excited to be there. So are there any other questions? Yeah. How was returning to America? That is a really good question. Have you ever traveled overseas? Not for that long. So, they talk about culture shock when you go places because things are so different and you have to kind of get used to the people and the food and the customs. Coming back can be really, really hard, and it was really hard. I think we saw how happy these people were. They didn't have a lot of distractions. They just kind of enjoyed being together. There weren't lots of choices. Like, I remember one of my really strong memories was standing and trying to choose salad dressing in the grocery store. And, there's like 100 bottles of salad dressing, and I just couldn't get any because I didn't know what to do because we hadn't had the ability to make those kind of choices. I think when we came back, we really talked about how we wanted Sunday to be a day of rest. And I think that lasted for a few months, and it's gone away now, which is kind of sad because it really was a nice special day there. So it was very hard to come back when you see all the waste of America and all the distractions, people on their, phones and all that kind of stuff. And that was not something that we experienced there. So it was hard, very hard. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. How did the trip impact me? That's a good question. And I had done some traveling to third world countries before I went there, so I kind of knew what that was like. I think it, that's a good question. Do you want to answer that at all? I'm going to give that some thought for a second.
I think whenever you do something significant like that, it changes your life, and you're right, some of those are long-lasting kind of changes, and some of them are more fleeting. Our older girls, when they were applying to college and were writing their admission essays and so forth, they would talk about the experiences and how, what was it like being the only kid of a certain skin color and sharing that particular experience, or what was it like to not have hot water or some of the other experiences. So, whenever we've given this talk, we always chat amongst even the two of us about how much we are glad we did it. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard to uproot when you're familiar with things here, but it was such a powerful experience for us at the time, and even 10 to 15 years later, in terms of how this makes you really think about choices you make and really how blessed we are with all the choices here in this country.
I think it really made me appreciate some of the simple things in life. It did make me a little disgusted at the waste of America. For instance, the house where we stayed, there were 4 bedrooms, and we got to use 2 of them. So Scott and I were in one bedroom, and all 4 kids were in another bedroom. And there were 2 sets of bunk beds, and the dresser, you couldn't open it up all the way because it was so crowded in there. And Andrew's dresser was a little duffel bag that we brought with him because there wasn't any room. And it's amazing how you can do that when you have to, and the lessons that you learn about living together and being with other people, and you don't need a huge house. So in some ways it was hard. Like Grayson asked about coming back, you see the waste and what you don't need. For me, I think I really saw the love of these people. I think the love for God and the love for each other. And also makes me I love meeting people from new places because I think it's so interesting to share those experiences. So, any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So, not to put the kids on the spot, but what maybe was their favorite thing, or what did they feel
Sure. I don't know if you guys want to answer that or even know how to answer that because it was a long time ago. Do you want me to answer it for you? Or do you want to say anything? I think Andrew was, sorry. The question was, how did it impact the kids or what did they take with them? I was looking through some of the notes that I had sent emails to my family and they printed them off, and I was looking at that yesterday. And I think the kids really missed when we left, they missed being with so many people. They had 50 friends, just 50 steps down to the home. They had friends with them all the time. I think they really enjoyed the simplicity of life and having a lot of free time. I think for our older girls who, when you're in sixth grade, you remember a lot more than when you were in third grade. And I think I have seen them really want to reach out and, their mission trips that they've taken, that's been really important for them. Our oldest is pursuing a career in public health and wants to really help, people of the world who maybe can't advocate for themselves. So I do feel like in their heart, they really took a lot with them about helping other people. Anything else? Does anybody have a paper they want to turn in? No. Okay, do you? I see you hitting your sister. Do you have a question? You don't have to. Do you, Mallory? You don't have to. Okay. So I think what we'll do is we have a few minutes left, and let's break up into